And I want to ask you, do things just happen in your life, or do you think, or in the world, the important events, is it just mere coincidence? Or is God working in the background? Is he working quietly? Is there some sort of divine direction going on? Turn with me, if you would. I would like you to open your Bibles to Isaiah chapter 28. Isaiah chapter 28. And let's start with verse 9. God asked this question, and we have to look at it from God's perspective. And he asks this question, he says, to whom, this is the prophet Isaiah, to whom shall he teach knowledge? That is, to whom shall God teach knowledge? And to whom shall he make to understand doctrine? Those who are weaned from the milk and drawn from the breast? Well, it's obviously he's saying they must be more mature. If you're tuning in to this webcast, obviously you're probably quite mature because you're able to use a computer. You're able to follow what we're doing here. So you're not just a kid. Because he says, why is this so? And let's go to verse 10. For a precept must be upon precept, precept upon precept, line upon line, line upon line, here a little, there a little. Understanding God's truth, understanding the way of God, understanding God's revelation is a process. And we add bit by bit, teaching to teaching, so that you can have a full picture. There are many people who will just go and they'll pull a scripture out of context in the Bible and come up with all sorts of weird and wacky things. But that's not how the Bible does it. The Bible it's a very involved book to try to explain what God is doing in this with your life, what God is doing in the world. All these things, it is precept upon precept, line upon line. Verse 12. Okay, well, I just go back that. For precept upon precept and line upon line, here a little, there a little. Verse 11, for with stammering lips and a foreign tongue he will speak to this people. Of course, the Bible is written, here in Isaiah, it is written in Hebrew. To whom, he said, this is the rest that he gives to the weary. And this is the refreshing, yet they were not willing to hear, because the word of God, to benefit, to profit from it, to have a positive effect on your life, you must be willing to hear. That means willing to listen to what the scriptures are teaching. Verse 17, but of course most people are not willing. So he says at verse 13, so then the word of the Lord was to them precept upon precept, precept upon precept, line upon line, line upon line, here a little and there a little. And they say, oh, I can't be bothered. I can't be interested. Whatever it might be. And the scriptures say that they might go and fall backward and be broken and snared and taken. It takes a certain commitment to understand what God has to say. Because it's not just a question of saying, oh yeah, I believe God exists, and then go about your merry way. No, it's, I believe God exists, and that means if it's a real belief, then it's a commitment to actually act on that belief. And sometimes acting on that belief, it might cost you something. It might be inconvenient. Verse 14, let's go on here. This is Isaiah chapter 28, and verse 14, prophet Isaiah. Therefore, the word of the Lord, hear the word of the Lord, you scornful men who rule this people. So here God is addressing those who rule his people. Because you have said, we have made a covenant with death, and we have made an agreement with the grave. In other words, we've set it all up. Nothing's going to bother us. Nothing's going to interrupt us. Not even death and the grave. We've got it all set up. When the overwhelming rod shall pass through, when there are things, when the fat lady sings and everything hits the fan, Okay, when problems finally come to pass, when consequences for our bad decisions finally arrive, but they're saying it shall not come to us, for we have made what? We've made lies our refuge, and we have hidden ourselves under falsehood. This is where there are a lot of people these days who've made lies their refuge and hidden themselves under falsehood. You know, it's a remarkable thing today. You know, today is, of course, this Sabbath follows immediately from Friday. There was this announcement. This is the day after that Robert Mueller, who is a special investigator, who was asked to do a report, an investigation to see if there were lots of people who are alleging there had been collusion between the United States President Trump's campaign staff, Trump himself, and the Russians, Vladimir Putin. And what did Mueller come up with? What did he find? He spent a lot of time, interviewed all these people, and he turned in his report, and it turns out that he found no cause for indictment of anyone, from even the lowest ranking Republican up to President Trump. The people who have been indicted were what they call process indictments. These are people who, while they were nosing around, they said, we caught him. He didn't pay his taxes, He took this money he got for being a consultant to a Ukrainian, and he stuck it in a foreign bank account. So we nailed him, and he's going to prison. Or we caught him lying, or we caught him doing this, or we caught him doing that. But it wasn't what Mueller was looking for. And there is now, with releasing this, there is an enormous sense of disappointment, frustration, and people who are refusing to believe, people who have made lies their refuge and have hidden themselves under falsehood for years now. There's coming, as it were, there's coming an accounting. Because there are lots of people who've, in the media, in other words, very prominent individuals who've based a tremendous amount of personal animosity for something that just wasn't there. Verse 16, therefore, thus says the Lord God, behold, I place in Zion a stone for foundation, a tried stone, a precious cornerstone, a sure foundation. He who believes shall not be ashamed. See, God sets, if we're going to know what is the difference, how to determine what is right from what is wrong, what is true from what is false, then we have to have a source. We have to have an authority. And the authority ought to be the Word of God. Jesus said, John 17:17, thy word is truth. Man, in Matthew 4:4, man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes forth from the mouth of God. But the leaders of our people who rule this people, they're scornful men, scornful women. And they're making lies their refuge, and they're hiding themselves under falsehood. But the God says this. Let's go to verse 21 here in Isaiah 28. 17. So he's putting in Zion a tried stone, a precious cornerstone, a sure foundation. He who believes shall not be ashamed. Verse 17. Also I will make justice the line and righteousness the plummet. Well, I was, with my oldest son, and he's building a tree fort for my grandkids, for his children. And he's doing this with big logs and lashing and putting it up. And you're trying to, you have the level, you're trying to get the bubble right in the middle so that it's more or less level from this. And God is saying that He is building something, He's doing something, and He's saying, I'm going to make justice the line. You draw a line to see that it's straight, that it's the right place you're trying to construct, and righteousness is the plummet. Those are the measuring standards. Those are the standards of what He is doing. And the hail shall sweep away the refuge of lies, and the water shall overflow the hiding place. Those who are trying to hide themselves under falsehood. It doesn't pay. We cannot, by lying and falsehood, you can't avoid eventually the truth. It does come out. And what God has in mind, because he's laying in Zion a cornerstone, a precious cornerstone, a tried stone that is to be a sure foundation for the fulfillment of what God is promising. And God says this eventually. Let's just skip down here to verse 21 of Isaiah 28. For the Lord shall rise up as in Mount Perazim, and he shall be angry as in the valley of Gibeon, so that he may do his work, his strange work, or his extraordinary, his unusual work, and to bring about pass his act, his extraordinary, his unusual act. God has time, from time to time, he intervenes, and he intervenes in a dramatic fashion. Let's turn with me in your Bibles. Let's go to in the book of Joshua. Let's go to Joshua. Joshua chapter 10. Joshua chapter 10. Because when I quote here from the prophet Isaiah, when I say, for the Lord shall rise up as in Mount Perazim, he shall be angry as in the valley of Gibeon, most people don't have a clue what I'm talking about. So let's actually take a look and see, because here we're talking about that at one point in time, God is going to intervene in a powerful, dramatic, and a mighty, in an overt way, and it's going to surprise people enormously, and they're not going to be able to hide themselves under a refuge of lies and deceit. Joshua chapter 10. Verse 1. And it came to pass, when Adonizedek, king of Jerusalem, this is during the day when the Canaanites were still in the country, before the children of Israel had put out all the Canaanites, God told them to, had heard how Joshua had taken Ai and had utterly destroyed it, as he had done to Jericho and his king, so he had done to Ai and his king, and how the inhabitants of Gibeon, who were one of the people, and this is in the West Bank, what we call the West Bank, okay, one of the Amorite peoples of that land, one of the Canaanite sort of people of that land, had made peace with Israel and were among them. Now, there's a story behind that, okay? But they decided, hey, we're going to make a deal with the new boss. And they recognized that there was authority. They recognized there was something behind Israel and his God, and they wanted to be on the winning side. They managed to shift their allegiance. Okay, they used cunning to accomplish this. But even though they took in the Israelites, because they didn't actually talk to God about that, God made them keep their word. Okay, you always keep your word. It was always very important from this aspect. So you had this at this point in time. These people. They had heard this king that was then in Jerusalem. His name was Adonizedek, and he had heard that the Gibeonites were there, and said, "Oh well, we've had somebody break ranks." So, verse 4, come up with me. So he sent to various other of the Amorite kings, king of Heshbon, the king of Jarmuth, and the king of Eglon, and the king of Lachish. All these other cities that were around there in what we now call the Promised Land. He told them, come up, verse 4, and help me, so that we may strike Gibeon, all the Gibeonites, all these people who had made a truce, had made an agreement or a covenant of peace with Israel, a treaty, for they've made peace with Joshua and with the children of Israel, so we're going to get them. We're going to make an example out of them. And of course, so they set up all their armies from these surrounding kings. They got together, made an alliance, and went up against them. And they came against it. And the Gibeonites were able, by a tunnel or however it was, get a message to Joshua, say, we've upset everybody else in the land, and they're all coming up to kill us. Come and help us, because we're your allies. And it says, verse 7, so Joshua went up from Gilgal, where he was camped, right across on the eastern west bank of the Jordan River. And Joshua went up from Gilgal, he and all the people of war with him, the mighty men of war. And the Lord said to Joshua, "Do not fear them, for I have delivered them into your hands, for they shall not be a man to stand before you." And Joshua came to them suddenly, and coming up from Gilgal all night. And the Lord troubled them before Israel, and killed them with a great slaughter at Gibeon. So all these people who had come up, other Canaanites who tried to kill the Gibeonites, he troubled them, and they chased them along the way, all the way it goes up to Beth Horon, and struck them to Azekah and Makkedah. So they're chasing them. They're routing them, and as they're running down the roads, they're after them. They got the swords. Okay, from that point. And it came to pass as they fled from before Israel and were in this descent of Beth Horon, because they're trying to get back to their home bases, the Lord cast down great hailstones from heaven upon them to Azekah, and they died. And the many who died from the hailstones were more than the children of Israel killed with the sword. So God intervened and sent these powerful hailstones on this fleeing army that was retreating as fast as they could. And of course, you get hit by a big hailstone, and it was killing them. In verse 12, then Joshua spoke to the Lord in the day that the Lord delivered up the Amorites before the children of Israel, and he said in the sight of Israel, "Sun, stand still upon Gibeon, and moon, stand still upon the valley of Aijalon." And the sun stood still, and the moon stood still, until the people had avenged themselves upon their enemies. Is this not written in the book of Jasher? And the sun stood still in the midst of the heavens, and did not hasten to go down about a whole day. And there was, verse 14, and there was no day like that before it or after it, that the Lord listened to the voice of man, for the Lord fought for Israel. This was a very dramatic incident of God breaking into history and intervening. And from what I understand, people who were planning some of the Apollo missions and the astronomers, and when they were trying to set things up, to take account in their planning trajectories and things and time, they actually had to take account of this to make the mathematics work out correctly. It seems remarkable to us now. How could this be? This is a remarkable, open intervention, that God had. And, as I was saying before, when God was going to intervene, again back to Isaiah 28 and verse 21, "For the Lord shall rise up at Mount Perazim, and he shall be angry as in the valley of Gibeon, so that he may do his work, his remarkable, unusual work, to bring pass his extraordinary act." We have the Perazim was another time, hundreds of years later, when David when he first came in, was anointed king over Israel, and the Philistines came up as soon as they heard he was anointed to attack him and to kill him. And David came out to defend against the Philistines, and God actually intervened. The first time he came straight out, and he defeated them that day in the battle, and then they came back again. And this time when they met, God said, "Go around behind him and wait till you hear." And he heard God went out, and he could hear the voice of the sound of the marching in the trees, and they were hiding in an aspen grove, and they could hear God going before them to strike them. So this is what Isaiah is referring to, some very dramatic, remarkable events in Israel's history of overt intervention of God in world affairs. But does God always have to work that way? No. Sometimes God works in the background. Sometimes God works in the shadows. Sometimes it seems there are mere coincidences from this standpoint. 7 years ago, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu presented a pointed gift, to then President of the United States, Barack Obama. And this happened about this time of year in March. It was during the days of Purim, which is a story of Esther and Mordecai, one of the books of the Bible, the book of Esther. And Netanyahu presented to President Obama a copy of the book of Esther, which tells about the genocidal plot against the Jewish people that had been devised by Haman the Agagite, or in other words, or Haman the Amalekite. Now, Esther recounts what is actually somewhat a contemporary story, because in antiquity, at the time of the book of Esther, there was the land of Persia, which we now call Iran. The land of Persia was run by a prime minister who was an oppressive and vengeful leader who was seeking the total annihilation of the Jewish people. He was highly anti-Semitic, or he was the Nazi, the Hitler of his day, if you would. And so from this, when Netanyahu, Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel, visited Barack Obama, he gave him a copy of this book, because it was sort of a subtle meaning, because Barack Obama was not really very much, if you look at the story of his presidency, he was not very much of a friend of Israel. He wanted to have reset his policies to actually tilt towards the Muslim world. You have a reset. He went over and made a big speech, and he did a variety of these things, and he was not getting along very much with the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu. And this is when Netanyahu gave him this book. He was trying to pass on, he was trying to signal, what the Jewish perspective was in dealing with this conflict, because just like we're dealing right now. The Iranians, under the religious guide of the Ayatollahs, Shiite Muslims, you listen to them, they constantly talk about wiping Israel off the face of the map. There's a whole conflict about them developing nuclear weapons and the missiles, the long-range missiles capable of delivering those things. And of course, this is even now. There's very much, this is a great deal of politics is going on in this. It was 7 years ago. It's still going on right now. Because the Israelis, most of the Israelis, they looked at Esther and they said, we see in world events things similar to what happened back then. Because they're this whole idea of how they were going to destroy the Jewish people. God, God's old covenant people. But it didn't happen. See, there was the fellow Haman, the Agagite, or the Amalekite, so many years ago. He also wanted to kill everybody, but it didn't come to pass. And the book of Esther is a remarkable story of what happened. And the book of Esther starts, and I have time, so I'm going to go over a little bit. Let's turn to Exodus. I'll give you a little bit of background, because it is line upon line, here, there, a little, there, a little, so you can understand the whole story, to understand, because it's amazing. You think about this, where we look at, I'm going to go back to the book of Exodus, about 1445 BC, to understand now a problem of what's still going on in the 21st century. How does God work? Yeah, it is here a little, there a little. God reveals what he's doing in this way. Let's go back to Exodus chapter 17, the book of Exodus, because this is where the story begins from that standpoint, this part of the story. Exodus chapter 17 and verse 1. And all the congregation of the children of Israel journeyed from the wilderness of Sin after their journeys according to the commandment of the Lord, and pitched in Rephidim, and there was no water for the people to drink. And the people argued with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink, that we may drink." And Moses said, "Why do you argue me? Why do you tempt the Lord?" And the people thirsted for water, and the people murmured against Moses and said, "Why is this that you have brought us out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" If you've never been to a desert, in a hot desert in the summer, and it's perhaps hard for me to convey to you what it's like to have this incredible thirst, whether your mouth feels like cotton and you can't seemingly drink enough water because your body is losing so much under that heat. And under that dryness, the desert sucks the moisture out of you. I mean, all we are is, if you would, bags of a fluid or a liquid. And when you get in that desert environment, it just pulls it out of you. Verse 4, and Moses cried to the Lord, saying, what shall I do with this people? They're almost ready to stone me. They're going past their point of endurance. And the Lord said to Moses, go on ahead of the people and take with you elders of Israel and take your rod with you as you struck the Nile. Okay, the whole thing of the Passover and the plagues that we'll be coming up to in a month, that we'll be rehearsing the story there. Take it in your hand and go, and I will stand before you there upon the rock in Horeb, and you shall smite the rock, and there shall come water out of it, so that the people may drink. And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. Now that sounds, this is rather remarkable. But I have been to the wilderness of Sinai. And I had the privilege of going there with Major Rotem, who was the Governor General of the whole Sinai Desert following the 1967 war. And I had the opportunity in 1973 to travel with him through the Sinai Desert. And he took us to this place and he showed us this rock. Now you say, well, how do you know it's this rock? Well, it's a remarkable thing because it was right by the traditional Mount Sinai. It's an enormous boulder filled this room. I guess it's better than 12, 14 feet high from that standpoint. I mean, and it was separate. It wasn't in the mountain. It was at the foot of the mountain. And you look at it, and there were these 13 lips. They look like lips in the rock. And below these each of these lips, you could see watermarks, like water had been flowing down. The rock was actually stained by flowing water, which you can see. If you're familiar with a little bit of geology and different types of rocks, what happens when water flows over them, I could see it with my own eyes. Anyways, it's a remarkable thing, and he called the name of the place Massah and Meribah because of the arguing of the children of Israel and because they tempted the Lord, saying, is the Lord among us or not? Is the Lord among us or not? See, they were in a problem, and God dramatically demonstrated, immediately solving the problem of thirst and the water for them and their animals, that he was there. Does God always do that? Immediately the thing thereafter, you have verse 8 here, then you have this account. Interesting. Immediately, is the Lord among us or not? Immediately that you have this account, and the Lord, and it says that Amalek, one of the Bedouin, if you would, tribes there, the desert, came and made war against Israel and Rephidim. So they got hit all of a sudden by a sneak attack. And so Moses told Joshua to go out and fight for them and stand, and and they fought against them all day long. And the Lord said, in verse 13, and Joshua defeated Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. And the Lord said to Moses, write this as a memorial in the book and rehearse it in the ears of Joshua, that I will utterly wipe out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. And Moses built an altar and called the name of it, the Lord my banner. Just like when you go into battle, in the old days they would carry banners. This is where our side is. This is where this sort of thing. And he said, because the Lord has sworn that the Lord will have war against Amalek from generation to generation. He'd have war against these people who were attacking his people. In verse, because the Lord said, he was, and it's interesting. I want to go here. I want to look at verse 16 a second. And I'm going to look at it in the Amplified Bible version, which is a little bit different. And it translates verse 16. And the Lord said, because the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation, because Amalek is their hand against the throne of the Lord. They were resisting God's rule and God's purpose, God's providence. because their hand, Amalek's hand, is against the throne of the Lord. It was contrary to God's sovereignty of what he had his plan was. They were trying to frustrate it. They were trying to deny it. They were trying to overturn it. But God was not going to allow it. Now, this incident, as I mentioned in Exodus, the book of Exodus, was about 1,445 BC. About 417 years later, God says, at this point in time, Israelites ask for a king, and you have King Saul. And Saul, he tells Saul, hey, I've got a job for you, Saul. I want you to go out, and I want you to wipe out the Amalekites. I want you to wipe out the Amalekites. That was about 1028 BC. As I said, 417 years later. But the account recalls that Saul didn't do a good job of it, because he instead decided to seize upon, the wealth, the booty, and all the other things when they struck the Amalekites' camp. So lots of the Amalekites got away, or enough, and the problem wasn't solved. And so there's going to be a further problem. After the time of Saul, then about 555 years would pass till you come to 473 BC. And at this point in time is this time of the book of Esther. And it's this, like 555 years ago, and this is an amazing time. You have, initial thing that happens in 1445 BC, and then God says, all right, we're going to deal with it now, and it's like 1028 BC, but it's not taken care of then, and then about 555 years later, at 473 BC, the problem comes back one more time. Is the Lord among us or not? The book of Esther is just a further development, line upon line, here, there, a little, there, a little. It's further development, the story of the Amalekites and their attacks, their desire to frustrate, they're on the throne of God and the people who were God's chosen people. And again, why were the Amalekites, why did God tell Saul to wipe them out? Why? Because the whole point was that the Amalekites' hand was against the throne of the Lord. It was trying to frustrate God's purpose. So the book of Esther was a further development of this conflict, which, by the way, is not done yet. But anyways, Esther has a point. Israelites sometimes, they want to see, is the Lord among us? They want some dramatic action. But how does God act? How does God intervene in the life of his people? The book of Esther seemingly recounts a series of what to be extraordinarily strange coincidences, unusual series of coincidences that had to be combined with, the challenges that had to be met by courage by some ordinary people among God's people. It would be a woman named Esther, or her Hebrew name was Hadassah, and her uncle Mordecai. Now, did the events that occur in the book of Esther, or is this just, some people say this is a fictional story, or did it really happen? Well, the interesting thing is, here in the 21st century, we can look at this and say, well, historians recognize, it's widely recognized that there's a great deal of historicity about the book of Esther. Because the leading Persian king at that time, who is featured in the account of the book of Esther, in Greek he was called Ahasuerus. Okay, his story was written up by the Greek historian Herodotus, who is sometimes called the father of history from this standpoint, which we know otherwise these days, we more familiarly call him Xerxes. He reigned from 486 to 465 BC. Now, the things that happened in that are narrated in the book of Esther took place. It starts in the third year of King Ahasuerus' reign, which fits into a period of time because Xerxes, there is a period of where it shows that he left. He was leaving on a trip, on an attack. He went to attack the Greeks, and this actually does fit the historical account because the book relates that he deposed his original queen, who was named Vashti, in 483 BC, and then it would be 4 years later that he would actually choose from this beauty contest this Jewish woman named Esther in 478 BC. So it does, the book itself, the timing, the chronological timing actually fits what we historically know, and in this case, from an outside account from Herodotus. And there are many other details of the Persian Empire of that time, the Achaemenid Persian Empire, that is, we now know just reflects how things actually were. The depiction of court life, their postal system, the extent of the empire and the number of their provinces, how officials kept official diaries, and how they used impalement as a form of punishment. All these things we know are historical. That was the nature. So we know these things are true. But what people have problem with, what secular scholars have an enormous problem with, is that the book of Esther recounts a series of what they say improbable circumstances. How could all these things happen one after another, all these improbable circumstances? That there just happened to be a crypto-Jewish queen who hadn't revealed her identity at that time. That was there. The idea that you had this man, Mordecai, who was ascribed to the king, who had heard about a plot to assassinate the king, and he had disclosed it, but he wasn't rewarded until 5 years later. And the fact that this was disclosed just happened just conveniently. It was brought to the king's attention merely hours before a man named Haman, who was his prime minister, who was an Amalekite, who hated the Jews, who he had a whole plan that he had put into motion to annihilate them, to have a genocide here in the 400s. The fact that Mordecai's service to the king would be recounted to him, to Xerxes, just merely hours before, so he'd be in a good mood for him. And then, they go on, later on in the story, you have Haman, begging for his life from the queen. It says the book recounts that he'd fallen on the couch, and Xerxes had walked out for a moment to get his breath of fresh air when Esther was doing the accusing, and he comes back and he sees Haman, there right next to his queen, and he takes it as he's trying to rape her. And he sends them out to be executed. Scholars have a little difficulty. So many different things, and I'm just naming some of the interesting, some of the highlight coincidences. There are many others. I encourage you to read the book of Esther. Is it improbable? Does God really take an interest in the life of his people? Does he get involved in such details? Can he plan ahead to pull off, the string of events that's mentioned in such a book of Esther? The book of Esther teaches some very valuable lessons. It shows a variety of things, and we'll read some of it when I do want to read it. Because sometimes it seems, we have a hard time. How does God really involve himself in our lives? How is he involving himself in the lives of his people? Most scholars readily point out when you look at Esther, Esther is kind of an unusual book because the name of God is not really mentioned directly. It's alluded to in the book of Esther, but not overtly mentioned. And yet God is always there in the background through the book, making things happen according to his will. What you see in the book of Esther is you see that God plans ahead. He plans ahead. He puts people in position, like it's like a chessboard. He puts people in position to play long before the events are actually come to a head or become relevant. Certain players. God makes Esther, who's Xerxes' queen, he has her selected in this really strange way, that she didn't want to be Xerxes' queen, but she gets picked as to be Xerxes' queen in order to provide a person, put a person in place who would be able, if she chose to intervene on behalf of her people, on behalf of the Jewish people, God's people, Old Covenant God's people, part of the people of Israel. God ensures. God has a plan. He is working. And he has a plan, and he wants to ensure that the good, and his plan will be carried out, will win in the end. And he's quite willing. We saw earlier, God can intervene dramatically. He did so in Joshua, make the sun stand still for a day, so when you're fighting your enemies, or intervene in such a way that he's there, as he did with David before, at Perazim, when he broke into it. Well, those are overt ways, but many times, and the book of Esther makes the point that God is always there, even when it seems he's not, or he's unseen. He's not intervening in a dramatic way. Let's go to Psalm 37, verse 23. And this is sometimes important for us because the world we live in right now, you have confidence that God is there, that he's taking an interest in the life of his people. He's taking an interest in the affairs and what's going on in your life. In Psalm 37 and verse 23, David, this is one of the Psalms of David. David said this. He said, "The steps of the godly are directed by the Lord. He delights in every detail of their life. Though they stumble, they will not fall, for the Lord holds them by the hand." So with those who God is working with, he directs them. He delights in every detail of their lives. That's sometimes hard to imagine, that God takes that clear notice. Jesus would say, hey, God notices, he's taking an interest in you, even down to the numbers of the hair on your head, which as you get older, get fewer, so maybe it gets easier for God. But anyways, he takes an interest. But he asks, from this standpoint, I want to look, he asks us to have faith in him. Even though he might be unseen, he is there. And he expects us to take faith in him. Let's go to the book of Esther. I want to read just a bit in the book of Esther. Esther chapter 3. We'll start with Esther chapter 3 and verse 7. "In the first month, that is the month Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, that is Xerxes, that cast Pur, that is the lot." So they were shaking, what we would say our equivalent of the dice. "Before Haman, who was Xerxes' prime minister, from day to day and from month to month, from month to the 12th month." So he was looking for a fortuitous day in which he wanted to launch his attack. This way he was sort of like Hitler. Hitler was also very superstitious and believed in astrology, and he looked for the right time to do his attack. And Haman, anyways, said to King Xerxes, he said, "There is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the people. In all the province of your kingdoms, and their laws are different from those of all other people, neither do they keep the king's laws." He's lying here, but anyways. "Therefore, it is not in the king's interest to allow them to live. If it please the king, let it be written that they may be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver," which is an enormous chunk of change. It's a lot of money, "into the hands of those who have charge of the business to bring it into the king's treasury." And the king took his ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the Jew's enemy. And the king said to Haman, "The silver is given to you." "I don't need your money, Haman. And the people also, do with them as you please. And then Haman had the scribes, the official court scribes, write to all the 127 provinces of the empire and say, hey, on this day, the month of Adar, Hebrew calendar, which was this past week, by the way, Purim, this day you're going to attack them. You're going to kill them all, men, women, and children, and plunder the goods. And of course, in other words, there's financial incentive. Hey, get on with Haman's plan and do that. Let's go to Esther 4. We'll read verse 1. Esther 4 and verse 1. When Mordecai understood all that was done, Mordecai tore his clothes. As Mordecai is the uncle of Queen Esther, and put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out to the middle of the city and cried with a loud and bitter cry. So at this point in time, Mordecai is taking a very public position. It's sort of like, and by doing this, it's better than the social media posts today to get people's attention to what's happening. And he even came before the king's gate, but none might enter into the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. Okay, so because it's an official sign of mourning. And in every province, wherever the king's command came, there was a great mourning among the Jews, and fasting and weeping and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes, because destruction had been decreed against them to kill all these people. It's like Hitler writing to Eichmann, put them in the ovens and gas them and burn them. And Esther's servant women and her officers came and told her, and the queen was exceedingly grieved, and she sent clothing to clothe Mordecai and to take away the sackcloth from him, but he would not restore it. And Esther called for Hatak, one of the king's officers, whom the king had appointed to attend to her, and gave him a command to go to Mordecai to learn, what was going on and why it was going on. And Hatak went out to Mordecai in the street of the city in the front of the king's gate, and Mordecai told him of all that had happened to him, and of the sum of the silver which Haman had promised to pay to the king's treasuries for the Jews, blood money, in order to destroy them. And he gave him a copy of the writing of the decree that was given at Shushan to destroy them, to show it to Esther, and to declare it to her, and to command her that she should go into the king and make supplication to him, and to seek help for her people. So he was doing this to get Esther to take action, to stand up, to make a difference. And Esther spoke to Hatak and gave him a message for Mordecai. The king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that whoever, whether man or woman, shall come to the king into the inner court who is not called, there is one law of his, execution, except such as to whom the king shall hold out the golden scepter, so that he may live. But I have been called to come into the king these past 30 days. And they told Mordecai Esther's words. And Mordecai commanded them to answer Esther, do not think within yourself that you shall escape in the king's house more than all the other Jews. For even if you are completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance shall arise to the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house shall be destroyed. And who knows whether you have come to such a royal position for a time such as this? Yeah, Mordecai was asking his niece to go in, to risk her life, to stand up and to be counted at a time of great danger, and where it could cost her belief, could cost a great deal. And Esther told them to return Mordecai this answer, go gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan, which was the summer capital city there in the Persian Empire, and fast for me, and do not eat or drink 3 days, night or day. My servants and I will also fast the same way, which is preparing herself spiritually for what was a life and death situation. And I will go in to the king, which is not according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, and if I perish, I perish. And Mordecai went his way and did according to all that Esther had said. Mordecai and Esther were willing, because of their faith, because of their belief, to stand on God's side and to intervene for their people in their role as God's servants in the Persian Empire of that time. They took their risks. They would have known, of course, that God had said, back in Exodus 17 and verses 14 to 16, the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation, because the hand of Amalek is against the throne of the Lord. I think that's from the King James. It's a marginal reading, which leads me to suggest there was maybe William Tyndale who translated it that way. But that's beside the point. But they were willing to act on their faith. The fact that all these coincidences that the book of Esther will relate, and I don't have time here to read the entire book. Read it, and you'll see the coincidence. All these coincidences, they add up to one to another to another. God was there, but it was behind the scenes. He did work for his people because he had a plan. If we go to Romans 8:28 in the New Covenant Scriptures, let's go to Romans 8:28. It's written here. And it says, "We know that all things work together for good for those who love God, who are called according to his purpose." Some people take this and they think, they'll think, well, this bad thing happened and that bad thing, well, it's all good, it works. Is that what God is saying? I actually like, better than Coulter's translation here, and maybe the King James, what the way the Good News translators put it, because I think it gets more to the point of what God is trying to convey here. We know that in all things, what happens? Disastrous things, times of great danger, in all things God works for good with those who love him, those whom he has called according to his purpose. I think that more reflects what God actually did with Mordecai and Esther. The fact that Haman wanted to, engineer a genocide, that wasn't good. But in those things, despite these enemies who were looking to destroy and to frustrate or trying to frustrate the throne of God, that in all things God works for good for those who love him, that he expects to stand in the gap, those whom he's called according to his purpose. Kasier also does a pretty good job in his translation of it. Moreover, we know that for those who love God, all things work together to secure their good. For those, whom he has called in fulfillment of his design. Paul's conclusion here in Romans 8:31 to 39 is that, if God is on our side, who's going to prevail against us? If God is on our side, who's going to prevail against us? If we do not repudiate God, if we are willing to stand up in God's sight and do what is right, then all things will eventually work for God and for us, if we're on God's side. Remember what Jesus said. And sometimes, and I'm sure, obviously this was not written at the time Esther went in and was risking her life, but Luke, in Luke chapter 12 and verse 5, it says, Jesus was telling his disciples at that time, he said, "I shall give you a warning of whom you should be afraid." Who is it you're to be afraid? The law of the Medes and Persians said if you walk into court and you're not called, you lose your head. But he said, "Be afraid of him who has killed and has the power to cast into the grave. Him, I assure you, you should indeed fear." And he said, "Do not 2 copper coins buy 5 sparrows? Yet not one of them escapes God's notice." You see, God looks at all the details, even the most common and humdrum things. A little sparrow. Why, the very hairs of your head have been counted, one and all. Cease feeling anxious. There is more in you than in many sparrows. Moreover, one thing I can assure you of, everyone who acknowledges me before men, I will acknowledge before the angels of God. And anyone who repudiates me before men, I will repudiate before the angels of God. Esther, at the critical moment, she did not repudiate God's people, but made cause with them, and instead advocated for them at a great personal risk. Yes, if we do not repudiate God, if we stand up for what's good in God's sight, then all things will eventually work out for good, because that is what God has in mind. And we see this is a remarkable message in the book of Esther, written some 473 BC, where God is in the background. He is working there. In our day, in our time here in the 21st century, it oftentimes seems God is in the background, but yet he takes notice of every detail in our lives, and we can have encouragement by that. Apostle Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 7, he points out that as Christians, we walk by faith, not by sight. We have to have faith that in all things God will work for our good. We need to be of good courage and have hope, always relying and knowing that God will fulfill his promises, and he can use the most amazing coincidences if he needs to.